Good afternoon and welcome. It's a very great pleasure for me to introduce Ashley Solomon, who's Professor, Chair and Head of Historical Performance at the Royal College of Music. He's Artistic Director of the UK-based ensemble Florilegium, which I had the great pleasure of working with Ashley in for 10 years. A very wonderful music making, very vibrant. Ashley's won many awards with Florilegium and also as a soloist. He teaches, he conducts around the world. He has a passion for Bolivian baroque music, which is the subject that we're going to hear about today. He's made recordings, he's done concerts, and he's toured Bolivian native musicians around the world. And in 2008, he won the Hans Roth Prize, which is a Bolivian award for recognition for assistance for Bolivian native Indians. Please welcome Ashley Solomon.
Thank you very much, Neil. And thank you for the weather. I feel at home. So it's very kind of you to organise that for me. Just get this switched on. Ladies and gentlemen, for the next hour I'm going to take you on a journey to Bolivia, in Latin America, and in particular to the missions or reductions established as early as the late 16th century in the Amazonian rainforest in the east of the country. Some 8,500 miles as the crow flies from here at the Sydney Conservatorium. In recent years I've developed a closer relationship with a unique culture that 20 years ago was unknown across most of Europe. In a remote corner in eastern Bolivia, approximately 200 miles from Santa Cruz, is Concepcion, a town now of about 8,000 inhabitants. At the time of the Jesuit missions, there were around 700 families, approximately 3,000 inhabitants. In its archive are the remains of two musical libraries taken from the parish churches of San Rafael and Santa Ana, two parishes that were part of the Jesuit missions to the Chiquitos Indians. The collections were brought to Concepcion in the 1970s by the Swiss architect Hans Roth, who was restoring the churches at the time. In the process of restoring various colonial churches, Roth recovered and preserved these musical manuscripts, although many pages were in a poor state of repair. The extraordinary history of the Jesuit missions in the former province of Paraguay reflects the highest ideals and aspirations of mankind. It is a history of incredible art, language, and literature, architecture, and music. The first Jesuit missionaries arrived in what is now Bolivia in 1572, having moved eastward from Peru, where they had established a province as early as 1568. They were preceded in Bolivia by other orders, the Dominicans, Franciscans, and Augustinians. These early missionaries were almost exclusively from Spain. For the most part, they attended to the spiritual needs of the colonists and local indigenous people in the arid Altiplano around Lake Titicaca, which is here, and cities La Paz, Potosí, and La Plata, today known as Sucre. On the 15th of May 1587, the first three Jesuits, Father Diego Martinez, Father Diego de Samaniego, and Brother Juan Sanchez, reached the remote eastern outpost of Santa Cruz de la Sierra. At that time, it was located near present-day San José de Chiquitos. There is Santa Cruz. There they were welcomed by Governor Lorenzo Suarez de Figuero and the entire town. It was the following year that Father Martinez began sporadic evangelization of the nearby Indian tribe. Meanwhile, the Jesuits had also penetrated into Bolivia's northern reaches, especially Mojos and Guarayo region, around Beni, there, and Trinidad. The first incursions there took place in 1596, although it wasn't until 1682 that the Jesuits were definitively established in Mojos. Their growth there was rapid, and within a few decades, the Jesuits had established 24 missions in the area. How successful were these early missions? Well, the success of these missions in Chiquitos and Mojos had everything to do with the Jesuits' insistence that these communities be run not only as centres of spiritual welfare, but of social welfare as well. Additionally, great emphasis was placed on 4 key elements: communal self-reliance and self-sufficiency, cooperation with, rather than coercion of, native inhabitants, as complete autonomy as possible from the colonial authorities. The Jesuit approach also had something else that would have enormous repercussions on the culture of Latin America as a whole: the development of an artistic synthesis between the missionaries and the native inhabitants. The Jesuits brought both a new means of cultural expression to the missions and adapted to the existing cultures of the native peoples. Although not entirely free of the superior attitude of most Europeans of their time, for the most part the Jesuits made great efforts to adapt to native cultures and rarely denigrated them. The result was a strikingly positive one. Along with their native counterparts, the Jesuits created fascinating microcosms, mission societies that were at once European and non-European, knitted together with a unifying spiritual theme, especially evident in its artistic and musical expression. Consequently, the worldviews and means of cultural expression of the peoples the Jesuits encountered were, of course, profoundly altered, but they did not disappear, which was the usual fate of most Native American Indian cultures after initial contact with European colonizers. Instead, they conformed and adapted and in fact reached their cultural height in the Jesuit mission era. The Jesuits trained their naturally proficient charges to become phenomenal craftsmen in several fields as an expression of their love for God. Those of the Chiquitos missions are best known for their musical skills. Even classically European musical instruments like the cello, harp, and violin were created anew in the depths of the Bolivian jungle by the inhabitants of the missions, without any innate knowledge of what they were making. They also composed numerous complex musical pieces and, of course, performed them. The tribes of the Chiquitos were talented in several other fields as well, especially in weaving and working precious metals and carving wood. Jesuit mission life was very structured. The Chiquitos missions were founded as autonomous, self-sufficient communities, ranging in size from 1,000 to 4,000 inhabitants, with 2 priests at their head, assisted by a council of 8 native leaders, who met on a daily basis to monitor the progress of the town and its inhabitants. One priest was in charge of religious instruction and the liturgy, the other was in charge of corporal matters, communal goods, land, workshops, etc. The mission's focal point was, of course, the church, which acted not only as a place of worship, but also as the primary cultural, economic, and education centre of each settlement. The mission churches, 7 of which have been more or less restored to their original state, were built by the combined efforts of the missionaries and the native population. 6 of them are now World Heritage Sites: San Javier, Concepcion, San Miguel, Santa Ana, San Rafael, and San José de Chiquitos. Between 1746 and 1756, the Swiss Jesuit musician and architect Martin Schmidt worked in the Chiquitos missions and built at least 3 extraordinary churches: San Rafael, San Javier, and Concepcion, built from wood and sun-dried bricks, and equipped them with carved altars, pictorial works, musical instruments, and compositions. Within 30 years, 7 churches had been built. I'd like to take you on a tour of these 7 churches now because they are quite remarkable. Concepcion, where most of the manuscripts are kept and where I've spent a lot of time, with an extraordinary bell tower here. That's a side profile with the decorations using natural colours, of course. The inside of the church. San Javier, probably the most decorated of the churches, more modest bell tower in the inner courtyard. Details above the opening of the church. And that's the inside of San Javier. One of the most beautiful of the 7 churches I visited. San Rafael, with the organ loft at the back. San José de Chiquitos, completely different style, That's the bell tower there. San Miguel. And the most modest and furthest from Santa Cruz, Santa Ana. I'll return to Santa Ana a little later. The enormity of the task of building these churches is scarcely imaginable today. They didn't spring up overnight. It took years of painstaking work, with every piece made by hand. Let's consider the church in Concepcion, begun in 1752. According to Schmidt's own correspondence, more than 2,000 hardwood trees were felled. Each of the church's massive beams are over 12 metres in length and weigh over 9 tons. To roof the church, more than 100,000 tiles and bricks were used, and a further 150,000 bricks for other sections of the church. These vertical columns weigh in excess of 20 tons. All this was done by hand, using only the crudest of tools. The result was a church that holds over 3,000 people. It all came to a sudden end on the 27th of February 1767, when the Spanish king Carlos III ordered the expulsion of the Jesuits from his realms, including the scarcely 24 missionaries who were working and watching over the enormous Chiquitana territory. With it came the end of a truly unique era in history, but one whose legacy still live on for the artist, historian or musician to appreciate. The encounter and intensive interaction between native and European religion and culture, which occurred within the Jesuit missions, gave birth to a new culture, the culture of the missions. It enriched Baroque art with a new aspect, not simply an imitation of European models, but a new concept of Baroque. In this context, a new musical style emerged, known by many as missional Baroque, a name given not only because of the quantity of works produced, but also because of its originality and unique characteristics. Although the European foundations evident in this style cannot be denied, they only served as models and were transformed according to the taste, abilities and preferences of the indigenous peoples themselves. Although it's true that the contributions of the locals often remained obscure, they never ceased to be present. The 8 decades of the presence of the Jesuit missions among the Chiquitos and Mojos Indians in the Amazonian rainforest to the east of Bolivia saw a rapid development of the musical training of the indigenous population. By the time the Jesuits were expelled in 1767, an impressive collection of musical manuscripts had been produced by the composers and copyists in ancient missions such as San Rafael and Santa Ana in Chiquitos and San Ignacio in Mojos. The Jesuit historian and musicologist T. Frank Kennedy, in his essay Colonial Music from the Episcopal Church of Concepcion, Bolivia, presented a brief history of the music in the missions and summarized the contents of the archive in Concepcion. The discovery of more than 5,500 pages of music from the missions occupied most of this research. Dr. Piotr Nawrot, who works in Bolivia and is a Polish priest, has devoted the last 20 years to the transcription of the musical works from this archive. To date, 37 volumes of this music have been published, and talking to one or two of you, I know that you've already got some of the music. But perhaps the greatest advance in promoting the achievements of the past was the foundation in 1996 of the biannual International Festival of Renaissance and Baroque Music, Misiones de Chiquitos. This festival presents concerts in Bolivia, in the churches of the Jesuit missions, and is coordinated by APAC, the Association for the Development of Art and Culture in Bolivia. The festival has helped to generate an awareness, pride and interest in discovering, preserving and reviving the culture of the missions in all its forms. And this is where my journey began in 2002, when Florilegium were invited to take part in the 4th festival. We took a programme of European Baroque music to play in this festival, and Piotr Nawrot gave us a piece of music, which is what he does with every ensemble that comes to play in his festival. A piece of music from the archives, hopefully something that nobody in the ensemble has seen, and he handed us a piece, Pastoretti y Cepiflauta, a recorder concerto. And one particular story that happened when we performed in San Javier, I'll save till a little later to share with you. But when I came back to Santa Cruz, having been in the missions, I asked naively if there was any more music like this. And he simply laughed and said, "I've so far seen 5,500 pages of manuscript from the archives. Are you interested?" Well, Ladies and gentlemen, that's a little like being a kid in a sweet shop. Of course I was interested. And within a year, we arranged to put on a concert of Bolivian Baroque music, the first in Europe, actually at London's Wigmore Hall, with Florilegium, and 4 soloists, including Dame Emma Kirkby. At the same time, we also gave a performance at the Early Music Festival in Newcastle, and supported by the Friends of Bolivia, the Wigmore Hall raised £10,000, which we used to buy musical instruments, modern musical instruments, for children in Bolivia who play in the orchestras who couldn't afford to buy them. The reception following the Wigmore Hall concert, the director of the Prince Claus Foundation spoke to me. Prince Claus was the late husband of Queen Beatrice, the Queen of Holland, and before he died he set up a fund to promote art and culture in Latin America. If you're cynical, you'll say because he plundered the reserves of the country while he was alive. And the Prince Claus Foundation were very interested in this project, but they said to me, well, it's a bit too English for our interest. So after a second glass of champagne, I foolishly said, well, of course we could replace the 4 English singers with 4 Bolivian singers, not quite knowing what I was letting myself in for. And so in December that year, I was sent to Santa Cruz to audition any singer who wanted to be part of this project, a sort of X Factor, if you will. And any singer who was interested was flown to Santa Cruz to audition. After hearing about 54 singers, I selected 4 singers to take part in the project. And in the debrief back in Europe, they simply asked what would it take to get them to a level that you would be prepared to work with. We decided that I should commute once a month for a week to work in Bolivia with the singers and teach them to prepare them for the festival, which was happening only 5 months later. The lead soprano came to London to have lessons with Emma Kirkby, the tenor to Chile to have lessons with a colleague of mine, Rodrigo del Pozo, who some of you know. The background of the 4 singers are interesting. 2 trained in North America, did music degrees in North America. One singer was very against being a musician. She is 3rd-generation opera singer and didn't want to sing at all, but passed the audition and got very excited about the possibility. And the tenor was a mariachi singer in a band. He could read music. At the festival the following year, we launched the project, the cross-collaboration between the 4 Bolivian soloists and Florilegium, and I convinced our record company that they needed to fly out and record this program in the Church of Concepcion, where the music was held. So our record company flew over 300 kilograms of equipment. All they could guarantee us was a generator in Concepcion at the time. And he brought all the equipment, and there we made the first recording. And it's there that I met a wonderful musician, Don Januario, who's the director of music in Santa Ana, who I'll return to a little later. Following the recording, a further 8 trips that year to prepare for the launch of the CD in the main hall of the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam, in Wigmore Hall and the Musikverein in Vienna. The First Lady of Bolivia came to the concert in Amsterdam, and after the performance, again, I should have learnt my lesson. The director of the Prince Claus Foundation said, so what about another project? And I'd just been speaking to Piotr Nawrot about the 6 Bassani masses that he'd found in one of the archives. So I said, well, let's find a choir to record the masses. So yet again, I went out to Bolivia and auditioned 15 choirs, and I wasn't happy with any of them really. So I asked if I could just simply put singers together from different backgrounds, not caring where they came from in the country, but just to find the best sound. And after a week, we put together a choir that was to become and is Aracaenda Bolivia. Again, much rehearsal, and 2 years later, Channel Classics again came to Bolivia, to Concepcion, where we recorded this mass with Aracaenda Bolivia. Aracaenda, incidentally, is a Guarani word which means ancient. It was very much a word that the choir came up with for their name. And it was at this festival, when we were making the CD, that the CBS documentary 60 Minutes came and did one of their programs based on our work. And they agreed to release it on Easter Sunday across America, the day we released our CD in the States, and 14 million people watched it. Now, the knock-on effect was extraordinary for the CD sales, but more so, American people started pledging money to the project. So we set up a fund in order that anyone who was involved in my projects can go and have lessons anywhere in the world. And eventually we actually built a school in the jungle to teach the teachers how to teach Baroque music effectively. That way reaching far more people. 2008, we had a tour of Europe with Aracaenda Bolivia, ending up in Holland, and recorded the 3rd volume in the Walserkerk in Amsterdam, much to the relief of our Dutch-based record company. And that CD was awarded runner-up prize by BBC Music magazine for the finest choral CD of the year beating all the Oxford and Cambridge choirs. So they did see something quite unique in the choir. 2010, we started using some of the money to buy baroque instruments for the plan to build a baroque orchestra. Not to do florilegium out of work, but ultimately the idea is for Bolivians to promote their own music and not to have this cultural exchange between my ensemble and singers. So we started investing in an orchestra, and 4 years later, last year at the festival, they gave their debut performance, together with Norwegian brass, a brass ensemble, Aracaenda Bolivia choir, of course, and I was fortunate to bring 6 of my students from historical performance from the Royal College of Music out to Bolivia to take part in the festival with the orchestra. The programme we performed at the festival last year was unique in that it was a whole programme with texts in Guarani. Not Latin, not Spanish, but Guarani. And for me it was very important to find a choir that spoke Guarani. And so we came across a wonderful choir in Palmarito, where they only speak Guarani. It's an incredibly poor neighbourhood, and the director of music was in the first incarnation of Aracaenda Bolivia, so it seemed so appropriate that we would work together. And so I worked with this choir to prepare for the festival. I have a video to show you, but it's unfortunately 19 minutes long, so I'm only going to show you about 4 minutes. If there's time at the end, we'll return to it. But this was made by the French petrol company Total about the promotion of this cross-cultural relation, and the first time this music in Guarani texts was available to anyone. Sorry I have to stop it there, ladies and gentlemen, but if there isn't time, I'll just fast forward to the end, to the final performance for you to enjoy, and I will remember to come back to that slide. But just some pictures of Aracaenda Bolivia, the Baroque Orchestra with students from the Royal College of Music, the combined forces of the Palmarito choir, Aracaenda Bolivia on the right, and in concert in Santa Cruz. Wonderful, humble people. So what is the future, and what are our future plans? Well, on the back of this performance, I then took Aracaenda Bolivia choir and orchestra on a tour of North America in March, organised by the Kennedy Center in Washington. And in 2016 at the festival, we plan to perform Cerruti's Mass for 4 choirs and 4 orchestras, together with his Vespers and their Requiem Chiquitana, which has recently been found. The discovery of over 5,500 pages of music from the Jesuit missions of the Chiquitos, held in the archive in Concepcion, and almost 7,200 pages from the Moxos missions, watched over and hand-copied by the local missionaries and indigenous people right up until 2005, gives us a new inspiration to examine the contributions made by the missionaries and the indigenous people to musical life there. It's no surprise that the majority of the music is sacred in nature, given that this was the main tool for evangelization to convert the Indians to Christianity. There are over 200 instrumental works, around 120 sonatas, and 80 concertos in the archive in Concepcion. In most cases, the copyists left no details of who was the composer. They were encouraged to do this by the Jesuits, and simply to sign them off as anonymous, ad maiorem Dei gloriam, to magnify the glory of God. Musicologists have recognized a number of works by well-known 17th and 18th century composers, including Corelli, Vivaldi, Locatelli, Balbi, Sammartini, Calandro, and Domenico Poretti. The original sonatas by these composers were simply copied, arranged, and often simplified by local musicians trained in the missions. And there's no evidence to prove that any of these instrumental works were originally composed by the Indian people. It is conceivable that at least sometimes when performing this music, they may have used selected native instruments, but to date it has not been possible to confirm how they would have done it. An interesting example of how they adopted a title of a work. Many of you, of course, know the title La Folia, if you think of Corelli or Vivaldi or Geminiani. Well, La Folia has Portuguese origins from the 15th century, and it's pretty crazy dance, often referred to as a mad dance, an empty-headed dance by the performers. Well, I came across a piece entitled La Folia in the collection, in the archive. Of course, you'll all know that La Folia is in three beats. This was in 2. They didn't understand the concept of the dance, but they loved the title, and so adopted the title, and so called the piece La Folia. Another more recent example is in the festival last year. I gave a premiere of a new concerto Piotr had found for flute, strings and cello, entitled Concerto Pizzicato. Now, I've been playing the flute for 30 years. I still can't play pizzicato. But in 12 bars in the slow movement, the composer had written pizzicato for the strings, and clearly the copyist fell in love with this word and decided to call the entire concerto Concerto Pizzicato. It's quite a charming work, actually. The instrumental repertoire in the archive in Moxa is scant, holding only about 20 sonatas. Virtually all the music in that archive is vocal. And yet, according to contemporary reports, there was a vast collection of music for small instrumental ensembles, specifically strings and wind and for keyboard. But no manuscripts have survived, or perhaps we still haven't found them. Many of the Indian pupils in the mission school became proficient musicians at quite an early age, and their musical talent was highly praised by many who visited the missions. Here's the testimony of a Spaniard who accompanied the Bishop of Asuncion on his regular visit to the missions. In one of the last visits which His Lordship our Bishop made among the Guaranis, we were just coming into one of the reductions. All the inhabitants were assembled there to meet the Bishop. A choir of children advanced, singing the praises of the Christian doctrine. But one amongst them very soon engaged the attention and eyes of as many Spaniards as we were in the company. He played on the violoncello so gracefully and in so masterly a manner that the prelate, struck with admiration as the rest of us were, ordered the choir to stop and the child to come nearer and play a sonata by himself. The child came forward in obedience to his lordship's orders, and after making a low and respectful bow to his lordship and the persons who attended him, rested the instrument on his foot and played about a quarter of an hour with such exactness and so nimbly that it was impossible to tire of hearing and admire the performance. If you can discern the music, that's Sonata 18, which is the manuscript that we use for the front cover of a CD. And I'd like to play you just a little bit, and you can now follow the music and see whether we made any mistakes. Sorry to cut it off so abruptly. The Italian influence is very clear, I think, for all. In the entire collection of colonial repertoire in the Americas, until the recent discovery of Concerto Pizzicato, which I just alluded to, there is only one work composed for flute or recorder, strings, and continuo, Pastorette y Cepiflauta. Copies of this work were only found in the Chiquitos archives. We know neither its composer nor its origin, but everything indicates that it was appearing in the missions around 1740, long after the decline of the recorder in Europe. This was the first piece from the archives that I became acquainted with when we performed in the festival in 2002. And it was in San Javier that the biggest impact occurred. The church was full of local Indians, about 1,000 in number. And when we performed the slow movement of this concerto, a large number of them sang along with me while I played. They use it every day in their service in Mass. They all knew it, and they certainly felt that they could and owned the rights to sing along. How often do we go to concerts where we know the music? Would we dream of singing along, ladies and gentlemen? No. It was a unique experience. Maybe that was done deliberately so I would be hooked in this for the next 15 years. Here's the opening movement. Oh. That wasn't the slow movement, by the way, that they sang. I'd be very impressed if they managed to sing along with that. To date, we lack the precise information as to the lineup of musical ensembles in the missions. The inventories seem to suggest a trend, where the continuo part was shared by harpsichord, organ, the high parts by violins, oboes, and flutes, and the low lines between the cellos, bassoons, and double basses. By the 1660s, it was reported that each church had an entire chapel of 40 musicians with all the most sonorous instruments that could be heard in Europe: vihuelas, harps, clavichords, zithers, lutes, and chirimias, or shawms, sackbuts, cornets, bassoons, organs, and harpsichords, all of which were not only played by the Indians, but built by them too. By 1692, Antonio Sepp was training in his music school 6 trumpeters, 4 organists, etc. You read the list yourself. 1774, Martin Schmidt wrote to his brother Francis, also a priest in Baden, Switzerland, that should be 1744, not 1774. The Jesuits had gone by then. Apologies for that typo. 1744, he wrote, "Today, all our towns have an organ and sets of violins, cellos, and basses, all made of cedarwood. They have harpsichords, spinets, harps, trumpets, and shawms, and I have taught the Indians how to play them. Our students who graduate from my school are true musicians who give thanks to our Lord every day at Holy Mass by singing and playing their instruments." The Italian-born Domenico Zipoli was the most important Jesuit composer who made the journey to South America. A renowned organist and prolific composer, although he never visited the missions, his music was considered as a model for all those baroque works composed in the missionary posts. Each mission would have 1 to 3 organs built by the Indians themselves, and it was the Indians who played the music out of the organ, not the missionaries or visitors, guests brought in to the missions. Zipoli, as I said, was a well-known composer, but his works were also adapted in the missions to suit the organ. This is a picture of the last remaining surviving organ in the mission churches in Santa Ana. Built by the Indians shortly after the expulsion of the Jesuits from their territories around 1770. The only change to this organ in the last 250 years are the pipes. The original pipes were removed, melted down and used to make bullets for the Chaco Wars in the 1930s. Play a little bit of a canzona by Zipoli in G minor on this particular organ. And the organist is James Johnston. Oops, that's not the organist. Incredible sound, so raw, so rough, but so extraordinary in the venue. It is quite remarkable, and that is a real sound that we recorded. So to the vocal works, taking on many different forms: processional music, solo arias, over 80 polyphonic masses, motets, and villancicos. The piece I'd now like to very briefly play for you It was first published in Lima in 1631 and is believed to be the oldest printed polyphony in the Americas. It's anonymous, 4-part, and used as processional march during the church service. It's Hanak Pachap, some of you may know it. It's in the language of Quechua, one of the Incan languages, and combines Christian and Incan imagery. It talks about references to heaven and to evil, stories of silver and gold, combined with palm fruit and cactus flowers. The next work, Kaima Ia Jesu, a solo motet in the Guarani language. A very simple, relatively naive composition where an instrumental line mirrors the vocal part almost exactly. Originally probably for violin, but the tessitura fits perfectly for the flute, and as there were flutes in the missions, I felt justified in playing you a version with the flute. So naive but charming, with a wonderful rhythmical spirit, which so much of this music has. They were presenting God in the most positive way. Although most of the vocal compositions were written by indigenous authors with some text like this in local languages, the manuscripts also contain these 6 masses by Bassani, 2 motets by Brentner, as well as 14 compositions by Domenico Zipoli. And they were used as models to teach music in the Jesuit missions. They have a unique value to help explain our knowledge of the musical culture in ancient missions in South America. Bassani published 6 masses, numbers 1 to 6, in 1709, and by 1730 they'd become part of the musical repertoire in the missions. However, significant changes were made to these masses. They were baptized, as you can see, with the new names, mainly of the missions. What was sought in the missions was not so much a musical aesthetic. Repetitions of the text as well as extended cadences in the Gloria and Credo were omitted in these arrangements made by local musicians. This served the purpose of allowing these works to become more liturgical in character and less of a concert performance when sung. This was the main reason why these new arrangements of the masses developed in the missions, and not because the musicians were limited technically and couldn't manage the high technical demands of these compositions. Despite the changes to the musical score, Bassani's masses lost none of their appeal. This process of adaptation, carefully defined and desired, enabled the works to find a new context in the missions. Here, music was not meant to promote the composer's genius or the talent of those interpreting the score. Simplicity was introduced to help members of the community to pray and to eliminate the distractions of an excessive repetitive text or disturbing ornamentation. Bassani's Missa Encarnacion is characterized by short sections with very much a positive aspect and perspective. Harmonic tension is limited, and tempi are invariably faster than European works of this nature. Let's consider Bach's B minor Mass, where the Kyrie lasts perhaps 15 minutes on a good recording. Here in the missions, Bassani's Kyrie lasts 4 minutes. This recording also includes the chimes of the bell in Concepcion that would call the locals to pray and take part in the Mass. Sorry to cut that short, ladies and gentlemen. The next example I'd like to play is anonymous. It's a motet entitled Stella Celi Extirpavit and was intended for the liturgical and feasts in honour of the Virgin Mary. It's very much in the antique or old-fashioned style and confirms the social function of music, a work specifically written for the church. It's quite intimate, it's a personal prayer, and in this recording it's sung by the 4 Bolivian soloists, 2 sopranos, a mezzo-soprano, and tenor, accompanied by theorbo, cello, and double bass. The lack of bass vocal parts in much of the music in the missions probably has something to do, and I've spoken to a number of colleagues about this, that the men weren't very tall, in fact, and the tenor voice was for many of them the lowest voice that they could actually nurture. The other reason is that, of course, the bass line exists in the score, and so the Jesuits felt that if there is a bass line being played by continual instruments, better to have more singers singing the higher parts. So tenors were encouraged to sing at this time. One of the most important influences in the missions, originating from the cathedrals of South America, came with the introduction of the villancicos. To date, it's not proved possible to establish at what point the villancicos made its first appearance in the missionary collections. This poetical musical form with words in Spanish, remember a language the Indians did not speak nor understand, heralded the end of a division between the Spanish church and the mission church. Church services would of course be celebrated in Latin, and in addition there is no single villancicos which has its texts in any of the native Indian languages, so these works are unusual on many levels. The archive in Moxa contains over 100 villancicos. Juan Araujo, 1646 to 1712, was born in Spain and went to Lima at an early age with his father and studied composition with Velasco. He was ordained as a priest in 1672 and appointed choirmaster of Lima Cathedral. By 1680, he'd moved to La Plata, today Sucre, in Bolivia, where he remained until his death 32 years later. In La Plata, he gained an excellent reputation for training choir boys. He was a prolific composer, writing over 200 works. Almost all of these were villancicos. The compositions were quite innovatory compared to the traditional form of villancicos he had studied himself. His use of effects such as unusual rhythms, syncopations, and word paintings were clearly conveyed, and are conveyed in this wonderful villancicos Fuera Fuera. Very briefly, the story starts with the Spanish mocking the Indians when they were praying, saying that nobody understands their language, God won't understand their language, they should leave the church and let the Spanish pray. However, they see how modest and intimate the Indians are praying, and by the end join forces with them and they pray together in separate languages. And you'll hear just a little clip of this now. Again, sorry I have to stop that. I was enjoying that too. The main goal of music in the missions was evangelization. The repertoire it served up was complete and included a wide variety of musical forms. Its first function was to praise God and elevate minds towards Him, and thus its sacred nature is undeniable. The people's cultures influenced the music, in that part of its repertoire was composed by local musicians and was almost invariably interpreted by indigenous musicians. The compositions brought from outside went through a process of assimilation to correspond to the Indians' musical tastes and preferences, and to the characteristics of the mission's liturgical practices of the time. The musical instruments people played were crafted in the mission workshops, with their makers using local materials for their manufacture. The music of the missions is different from traditional music of these regions' indigenous people, which is not to say that it is the same as that brought by missionaries and colonizers. Rather, it has a feature from both worlds. This is a picture of Don Januario from Santa Ana, the director of music. When we first encountered him, we asked him if he would teach us a piece of music, traditional music that was passed down the generations, not something from the archives, not something that we would be able to find ourselves. And as a violinist on an instrument he built himself, he played us a wonderful tune. 4 years later, for one of our recordings, we tried to find him so that we could actually record what he played for us. And were surprised that he only played us an instrumental piece, and during the recording session, he actually sang along with it. We asked his permission if we as Florilegium could make an arrangement of this folk tune, which follows immediately after this short excerpt from what we experienced in the recording session from Don Januario. Thank you.